Hello, this is Stephen Whitfield with Drilling Contractor. With me right now is Heather Horn, U.S. Strategic Thought Leader at PwC, and we're going to talk about the proposed SEC climate disclosure rule that has been a topic of great interest within the oil and gas industry right now, and with drillers in particular. Heather, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Yes, very happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
So, the million-dollar question that everybody wants to know is about sort of the details of this disclosure rule. For those of us who might not know some of the details about it, can you talk about what this rule is, and particularly what parts of the rule would you say that drilling contractors need to pay the most attention to?
Yep, thank you. So just to give a very high level summary of the rule, it has three main parts. It has disclosures in, we'll call it the front part of the registration statement or SEC filing, and that's primarily focused on climate-related risks, governance, and oversight, and the like. It also has required footnote disclosure. And then the final piece, and this actually does go in the four-part as well, would be greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. And I think we can get a little bit into a little more detail on those. But in terms of what to pay attention to, it's this actually relatively straightforward question, even without knowing all the details of the rules. It's starting to understand the details of the rules, but then really focusing in on your processes and controls, because this rule is not final yet. We do know that SEC is deliberating and that there may be changes, but no matter what changes are made, I think our expectation right now is that the SEC is going to require more climate-related information in your SEC filings. And if that's the case, drillers and other companies need to make sure that they have the right processes and controls in place to gather the information. Specifically, I would highlight, I mentioned greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. That's definitely one spot to focus on and to understand what you're doing now, and then what may be needed to report consistent with the SEC rule. Also, one key item I would highlight with respect to greenhouse gas emissions is that many companies already report those voluntarily, and those are typically calculated in accordance with guidelines provided by something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. What the Greenhouse Gas Protocol requires in terms of the entities included, or what they call the organizational boundary, is different than what's proposed in the SEC rule. So that's definitely something to kind of start to understand what that may mean for your company as you're looking at this.
Well, you talk about emissions, obviously scope 1, scope 2 emissions. We kind of know, measuring those is something a little more clear cut than scope 3 emissions. And that's such a big topic now within the industry. What does this rule say about disclosing scope 3 emissions?
So thanks for that question. And it definitely is one of the areas we've gotten the most questions about with respect to the SEC proposal. So let me summarize. As you said, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are required for all companies. When it comes to scope 3 emissions, they will not be required for smaller reporting companies. So if you're in that category, put this aside. You don't need to focus on this, at least for your own reporting. For all other companies, you will be required to report scope 3 emissions under one of two requirements. So the first one would be, you would be required to report it if it's material to your company. I'm going to come back to that question. And then the second one would be if you have a target or goal that involves scope 3 emissions. So for example, that would be if you had a goal, something like, we are going to be net zero by 2050 for all emissions. I think that would encompass scope 3, even if you didn't specify scope 3. Versus if you said, we'll be net zero for scope 1 and 2 emissions, then in that case, it would be out. But I think the real question that we're getting here is the materiality question. Two reasons. First is, materiality when it comes to something like greenhouse gas emissions, it's not good guidelines on how companies should be thinking about it. So that's sort of step one. And I think we typically would answer that that is a combination of quantitative and qualitative information. But then step two, I think the frustration companies have here is that this can be a difficult calculation. It typically requires getting information from others, from perhaps your own suppliers, thinking about how customers are using, your product. I'll use the word product loosely here. And, that information may be difficult to obtain. And then in order to figure out if it's material, you're still going to have to do the calculation. And so that, for some companies, it almost feels like the hard part you're going to have to do either way. And so we have gotten a lot of questions about that. And that was an area where we did see a lot of SEC comments questioning whether it's sort of scope 3 disclosures are ready for prime time.
So this rule has sort of the proposal has been sort of out for the last several months. But whenever it will take effect, I mean, that's still is kind of a question that's a bit up in the air. We don't know when it's going to take effect. So, but it could take effect really soon. So what can companies be doing right now, or what should they be doing to make sure that whenever it takes effect, they're in compliance with the rule?
So definitely could not agree with you more about the fact that it's going to be soon, or at least the expectation is soon. Now, originally, we thought that could be as soon as January 1, 2023 for large accelerated filers. Luckily, I think that is off the table, but nonetheless, even with the rule issued next year and effective January 1, 2024, that is very soon. So we have put out a publication that talks about some what we call no regrets moves companies could make now. And again, this is thinking about things that even if some of the details of the final rule are different, will still be important and helpful. And as we think about them, I'll highlight a few. First of all, would be to assemble a cross-functional team. So this is not something the sustainability folks are going to do in a vacuum. And this is not something that the finance team can do on their own. You need both of them. You need IT, you need legal, you need others who are going to be part of gathering the data and making some of these decisions. So that's really step one, and educating that team as well as your senior management and board is also critical. Next would be understanding what's required. And you may say, but the rule might change, that's wasted effort. But nonetheless, this is going to be, we would expect, the framework for what the SEC is ultimately going to publish. So understanding what's required now, even if you have to make some tweaks later, is going to get you much further down the road than some sort of hypothetical what you may want or need to disclose. Next, we would say you should inventory your existing disclosures and data. Many companies are already doing voluntary disclosures. And so starting with those and understanding similarities and differences with the SEC rule will again put you a step ahead. In many cases, we're seeing that the processes and controls for that current information is not at the level that maybe you would want in an SEC filing. So even implementing some of those changes now for your voluntary reporting can be helpful and get you one step ahead. And then final point I'd highlight here would just be to come up with a plan to address your gaps. So you have your team, you understand the requirements, you know what you have now, and that's going to leave you with gaps. So starting to figure out how you're going to fill those now will make sure things aren't a scramble later.
So PwC has noted about 14,000 comments to the SEC over this rule. Now, I don't profess to be the best expert on these types of things, but that sounds like a very high number. What are some of the comments that you're hearing? What's the gist of it?
Well, so first of all, definitely would agree with you that at least from my personal experience, this is the most I've seen. I do know that there have been others with more, particularly I think in the areas some like stock comp and otherwise. But I actually will point out that the number's even higher now than last time we spoke about this, because the SEC had to reopen the comment period because of a technical glitch. And as a result, there are about 900 more we call form letters submitted. And these are letters, that are similar, that are submitted by a number of different people. And then some additional, I'll call them individual letters. So up to 15,000, which is a huge number on any. The form letters in general, of which now we have about 12,000, are more supportive than non-supportive. So the original batch was about 90% supportive. Interestingly, though, you do start to see a decline in support the closer you got to the original deadline, and then these additional letters also were not as supportive. And so that may be just indicative of some additional education or otherwise in terms of the types of people who were responding. In terms of the letters from investors and companies, between those two categories, there were about 400 letters, and then there were additional about 600 letters that came from like public policy agencies, other regulators, other standard setters, and others, who may have a stake in it, but sort of focusing in on those investor and company letters. We did do analysis. Now, someone else may find something different if they looked at different letters, because we didn't look at all of them. But I think these trends are fairly representative. So the first of all is their proposal includes a 1% threshold for financial statement disclosure. So basically, if you had an impact that was more than 1% of an individual financial statement line item, that you would need to include disclosure in your footnote. Across the board, companies were opposed to that. That was one of the highest areas commented on. And even investors who were supportive of footnote disclosure were not supportive of this like 1% bright line, and instead suggested that it would be better to use regular financial statement materiality. In general, companies tended to oppose the footnotes. I think they felt like this was better disclosure for MD&A, with about 50% of companies commenting on that. We referenced the potentially close effective date. That was also a huge area of comment, with about 75% of companies, and actually a number of investors as well, suggesting that really more time should be given for companies to be able to comply appropriately. And then there were questions around scope 3, which we talked about, is probably another area where we saw a lot of comments. Now, the SEC is analyzing these comments now. What exactly they're going to do with the comments, it's hard to say, but I do understand from talking to some of our SEC reporting experts is that typically the areas of most comment are at least focused on and considered for potential change in the final rule. So no promises that it's going to change, but at least we would have an expectation that those areas I just highlighted are some of the areas that the SEC is talking about now.
Well, Heather, thank you for giving us this rundown of the rule. It's definitely been such a major topic of interest within the industry, and I'm sure that there will be more questions and more answers about this rule as it gets closer to a final form that will be out for the industry whenever it comes out. So thanks again for taking the time to speak with us.
Well, thanks again for including us, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
And thank you for visiting Drilling Contractor.